J'ouvre maintenant la séance.
I hereby call the meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 114 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Accounts.
All the witnesses we're going to have in the room today, and all members are in the room. Pursuant to the standing orders, members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. But alas, they are not. Everyone is here. A reminder that all comments should be addressed to the chair. Et conformément à l'article 108.
Pursuant to Standing Order 108.3G, the committee is examining Report 2, Housing in First Nations Communities of the 2024 Reports 2 to 4 of the Auditor General of Canada, referred to the committee on Tuesday, March 19th, 2024.
Welcome our witnesses, and we have a full house today. From the Office of the Auditor General, we have Karen Hogan, Auditor General of Canada. Nice to see you today. And with Ms. Hogan, we have Glenn Wheeler, Principal, and Doreen Devine, Director. Nice to see you both today. From the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, we have Michel Tremblay, Acting President and Chief Executive Officer, and Morley Lindstead, Director, Housing Solutions, Indigenous, and the North. Nice to have you here today. So pardon me, on this side, there's all these names up there, so nice to see you all. Department of Indigenous Services, Gina Wilson, Deputy Minister. Nice to see you as well, and I'll introduce your team as well, along with Joanne Wilkinson, Senior Assistant Deputy Minister, Regional Operations Sector, Nelson Barbosa, Director General, Regional Operations, and Dr. Tom Wong, Chief Medical Officer of Public Health, First Nations, and Inuit Health Branch. Thank you for all for being here. As is customary, we're going to begin with opening remarks from each of our witnesses. Ms. Hogan, you'll begin with 5 minutes, please.
Monsieur le Président, merci de nous donner la...
Mr. Chair, thank you for this opportunity to discuss our report on housing in First Nations communities, which was tabled in Parliament on March 19, 2024. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. This area is also known as Ottawa. I express my gratitude and respect to all Indigenous peoples who have contributed to shaping and safeguarding the beautiful lands they call home throughout Canada. Joining me today are Glenn Wheeler, the principal who is responsible for the audit, and Doreen Devine, the director who led the audit team. Many people living in First Nations communities do not have access to housing that is safe and in good condition. Overall, we found that Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation made little progress in supporting First Nations to improve housing conditions in their communities. Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation are responsible for working with First Nations to meet their housing needs by 2030. Although $4 billion was spent over the past 5 years to build new homes, repair existing ones, and increase First Nations capacity to manage housing, we found that in 2023, 80% of needs were still not met. The percentage of homes that need major repairs or replacement remains largely unchanged, despite the spending that has gone into building and repairing homes. In 2021, the Assembly of First Nations estimated that $44 billion was needed to improve housing in First Nations communities, and needs continue to grow. We found that the department and the corporation had not prioritized communities with the greatest needs. First Nations communities with the poorest housing conditions received less funding than communities of the same size with better housing conditions.
First Nations homes is a long-standing health hazard, and we found that Indigenous Services Canada and the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation still did not know the magnitude of the problem. In fact, the department and the corporation are currently not following the strategy that they developed in 2008 to address this problem, and neither could explain why the strategy is no longer used. There is no plan in place to tackle this issue. This is the fourth time since 2003 that we are raising the alarm bell about unsafe and unsuitable housing in First Nations communities. Adequate housing is a basic human need. After 4 audit reports, I can honestly say that I am completely discouraged that so little has changed and that so many First Nations individuals and families continue to live in substandard homes. Time after time, whether in housing, policing, safe drinking water, or other critical areas, our audits of federal programs to support Canada's Indigenous peoples reveal a distressing and persistent pattern of failure. The lack of progress clearly demonstrates that the government's passive, siloed approach is ineffective, and in fact contradicts the spirit of true reconciliation. A fundamental shift is urgently needed to drive significant progress in providing proper support to Indigenous families and communities across the country, especially those most in need who currently are too often left behind. While the government is at the early stages of transferring its responsibilities for housing to First Nations, unless the department and corporation tackle meaningful action to address the issues we have identified, it is unclear if the transfer will be successful. It is important to understand that these are not legacy issues that live in the past. They are ongoing and perpetual, with direct consequences that people experience on a daily basis, and they stand in contradiction to Canada's commitment to truth and reconciliation. We made 8 recommendations to improve the government's delivery of housing programs to First Nations communities. We are concerned that Indigenous Services Canada and Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation only partially agreed with our recommendation that they work with communities with the poorest housing conditions to ensure that they receive the support they need to improve their housing conditions. Mr. Chair, this concludes my opening remarks. We would be pleased to answer any questions the committee members may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hogan, for that for those comments. I'll turn now to the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. Mr. Tremblay, you have the floor for about 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I begin, I also would like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. For over 75 years, Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation has been helping Canadians to meet their housing needs and improve their quality of life. We've seen firsthand that having a safe, affordable home is essential for First Nations people to build the lives that they want for themselves and their families and their communities. It's a key step in our journey towards reconciliation. We know there's more work to be done to achieve this, and we're committed to working with partners to make this a reality. That's why we welcome the Housing and First Nations Communities report. It reinforces the importance of prioritizing First Nation housing, and it guides us to concentrate on the crucial issues that will help us effectively tackle this persistent issue, working closely with First Nations. Nous sommes d'accord avec les recommandations qui...
We agree with its recommendations, which are closely aligned with work already underway, and we've responded with clear plans on how to address them. Since 2016, the Government of Canada has significantly invested in housing stock and repairs. This includes the long-standing CMHC programs mentioned in the Auditor General's report. And here I refer to the Residential Rehabilitation Assistance Program and the on-reserve nonprofit rental housing program, also known as Section 95. These provide funding assistance to renovate and construct homes for First Nations living on reserve. It also includes on-reserve investments made through National Housing Strategy programs that CMHC delivers, such as the Rapid Housing Initiative, the Affordable Housing Fund, and the Housing Accelerator Fund, among others. As of December 31st, 2023, funding through the National Housing Strategy has helped First Nations to build, renovate, and retrofit close to 34,000 homes on reserves, with 22,000 of them already completed. In addition, we're delivering on the Indigenous Shelters and Transitional Housing Initiative. For this program, we collaborated with Indigenous Services Canada and Indigenous partners to help First Nations communities to build safe shelter spaces for survivors of gender-based violence. We recognize that significant strides have been made, but that there is still a lot of work to do, as the Auditor General of Canada's report notes.
Disparities between the housing conditions of Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities in Canada, especially on reserve. Historical treatment of Indigenous peoples, persistent racisms, and decades of underinvestments, rising construction costs, climate change, and overcrowding and population growth, these are all factors that have led to the current housing gap for First Nations living on reserves. And while we are committing to doing more, we also recognize that solving the housing challenges of First Nations communities is not something that the federal government can or should do on its own. First Nation communities are diverse, and so are their housing needs. Their leadership, communities, and organizations understand those needs best and how best to meet them. That's why we are changing the way we address housing when it comes to First Nation communities. As you may know, the Assembly of First Nations, the Chiefs Committee on Housing and Infrastructure, Indigenous Services Canada, CMHC, and Infrastructure Canada all work together to develop the National First Nations Housing and Related Infrastructure Strategy. This distinctions-based strategy includes funding for new construction and repairs, but it also addresses the need for sufficient, predictable, and sustainable funding so that care and control and management of housing can transition to First Nations. We've also been working with Indigenous partners on an urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy that is set to be implemented in 24-25. So as we carry out our plan to address the Auditor General's report, we will continue to work closely with Indigenous Services Canada and our other federal partners, First Nation partners, home builders, financiers, and community housing providers. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this matter, Mr. Chair. We are happy to take any questions from the committee.
And thank you, Mr. Tremblay. And last but not least, the Department of Indigenous Services. Ms. Wilson, you have the floor for about 5 minutes. Thank you.
Kwe. Hello, bonjour. I'm pleased to be gathered here on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, the land of my ancestors, the land of my current-day relatives, along with colleagues from the Office of the Auditor General, CMHC, and here at ISC. Pour commencer, j'aimerais remercier la
To begin, I'd like to thank the Auditor General of Canada for her report on housing in First Nations communities. We all agree that safe and suitable housing is foundational to ensuring First Nations are able to thrive, and we are currently working to address and implement the recommendations that were made in the spirit of true partnership and self-determination that First Nations people want. Indigenous Services Canada is aware of the substantial housing gap in First Nations communities, and we are working to address the ongoing and profound impact of a lack of suitable housing. This is a complex issue that has spanned generations.
In 2021, the Assembly of First Nations estimated the cost of closing this gap at $44 billion. It's a daunting number, but the first step to meeting needs is understanding them. In line with this, ISC is working in close collaboration with First Nations to better understand their priorities. The government cannot and should not do this work without the partnership of First Nations. With the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, we committed to not repeating the wrongs of the past, to not dictating what should be done in First Nation communities, but rather to listen and to support their leadership in advancing the vision and priorities they set for themselves. Since 2016, almost $4 billion has been committed through our department, And with this funding and additional funding from CMHC, First Nations are incrementally building and renovating nearly 34,000 homes. But we know there's still more work to be done. My colleague mentioned la stratégie nationale sur le logement et les infrastructures connexes des premières.
My colleague referred to the various programs.
From rights holders from coast to coast to coast who told us that a flexible funding model was a priority. This strategy serves as the foundation of ISK's housing policy and has shaped how we support rights holders and self-determination. Currently, we have a housing program that is not prescriptive. Communities can use funds to build homes, renovate spaces, clear mold, service lots, and create new subdivisions as they see fit. Communities choose what their priorities are and how to spend funding in the ways that work best for them. This is a key step toward our goal of transferring housing and infrastructure services. Transfers like a recently signed framework agreement signed with the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaqs, CMM. Once the transfer is complete, participating communities in partnership with the CMM will assume control of the design, management, provision, and delivery of all housing and infrastructure programs and services currently under ISK's Capital, Facility, and Management Program. These are markers of progress in the path to reconciliation. Partnerships like these are now helping us map a clear path forward to support the transfer of care and control of housing to where it belongs, with First Nation governments. To close, I'd like to note that my department will work with First Nations on these recommendations from the Auditor General's report, and we have already started to work to address them with our partners, and will start through our preliminary action plan. We are calling it preliminary because of the importance we place on working with First Nations. We intend to co-develop a final action plan with them, especially the Assembly of First Nations. This work will be embedded in our broader multi-year planning exercises with them. Service aux Autochtones Canada continuera à soutenir.
ISK will continue supporting the First Nations as they undertake the complex and intergenerational work of building homes that meet the needs of their growing communities.
To take your questions, Miigwech.
Thank you very much. We'll turn first to our first round of questions, which will be 4 members each with a 6-minute slot. Mr. McCauley, good to see you back. You have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thanks, Chair. A.G. Hogan, thank you for another depressing and dismal report. I'm going to start by quoting the AG's opening comments from the Emergency Services report, which was equally as dismal. She stated, Sheila Fraser, former AG, summed up her impression of Indigenous Services Department's actions after 10 years of audits as unacceptable. Keep in mind, this is 2011. She continues, 5 years later, which is 15 years after the original audit, Michael Ferguson, Auditor General at the time, used the words beyond unacceptable. A.G. Hogan herself then continues, we're now into decades of audits of programs and commitments that have repeatedly failed to serve Indigenous people. Now onto this report, I quote the AG, this is the 4th time we have raised concerns about housing. And 20 years later, many of these concerns persist. Indigenous Services and CMHC have made little progress to improving First Nations housing conditions. Now, I asked this question when you were here with us, Ms. Wilson, for the Emergency Services disgrace, I will use those words, is why should we not be calling for the termination of yourself and all the other executive from your department? Repeated failures, all we hear back is there's much more to do.
So First Nation housing shortages and overcrowding have been widely publicized for many years.
Do you take any accountability for this?
We take responsibility for this program.
Do you take any accountability or responsibility for this?
I take responsibility for this, yes.
Let me ask you, I'm looking at your departmental results from last year. And to quote from the government site, departmental results inform parliamentarians and Canadians of the results achieved by government organizations for Canadians. Your department achieved 16.9% of your targets, and yet 94% of your executives, I assume yourself, received an average of $18,000 in bonuses for achieving less than 17%, and 2 disastrous audits. Now I'm looking at your DRR's results. Percentage of First Nations housing that is adequate as assessed and reported annually by First Nations. You set a target of 75%, achieved, unspecified. The date to achieve that unspecified goal was March of last year, so no target set. Under self-determined services, percentage of First Nation housing that is adequate as assessed and reported by First Nations. Target to be determined, so no target set. Actually achieved, unspecified. Date to achieve the unspecified, untargeted number, unspecified. Under the housing program, percentage of First Nation housing that is adequate as assessed and reported annually by First Nations. A target of 75%. What did we actually achieve? From your own department, reported through Treasury Board, unspecified. And at least you set a date of March 23rd to achieve your unspecified results. Now these are from your department's own targets set in your departmental plans, which I will read to you. Departmental plans describe the priorities, strategic outcomes, programs, expected results, and associated resources requirements. So you come to this committee, present estimates, justifying the money that you're looking for based on these targets, and yet you've set no targets, and you can't even measure the targets that you haven't set. And yet somehow everyone got bonused $18,000, and we have probably the two worst audits I've seen, and I've been through maybe 30, 40 audits. How do you sit here and not offer anything to us? Like, when are we actually going to see that action? This goes back to 2001. And I realize there's a minister responsible, but you were deputy minister. You could actually set results, and yet we don't even have targets. How are we going to move forward with you still in this position? Because I don't have confidence that we're going to achieve anything that the AG is putting out with the current team here or the current minister here either. How are we going to achieve this?
Mr. Chair, if I can, I'd like to talk about that for the next 2 hours, actually, is explain some of the context around this and actually explain some of the context around indicators and how we develop those indicators and co-develop them with First Nation partners.
Actually,
Well,
So I get that the fact that there's a question that's being asked, but I can't hear a word from those because the person who's asking the question keeps talking over the witness.
thank you. I can hear. I recognize. I think
Put on
there's
a
going.
headphone,
I think there's going to be some give and take here. It's not got to the point where it's unruly unruly yet. I will ask Mr. McCauley to. You have a series. Do you want the floor back, or
I
do you
will
want
take the floor back. It is my time.
You are going to take the floor. Just. Okay, hold on. So having said that, I do expect it's going to be somewhat. There's going to be a bit of back and forth today. So I would, members, of course, it is your time. You can use all that time. But if you do pose questions, if you're able to allow some time for responses, of course you will want to police that they are not answers that take too much of your time. I do appreciate that as well. Mr. McCauley, you've got 50 seconds left.
Justify to Canadians this committee how 94% of the executives of your department receive bonuses despite achieving 17%. And tell us, how is it you have a departmental plan going forward without targets set or dates set on how you're going to achieve it, and you don't even know what you've achieved for the past year?
So if I can talk about executive bonuses, departmental plans set out broad, high-level program targets, and individual employees use specific criteria to provide individual commitments and key commitments. So to draw a parallel between a broad departmental target not being met and an executive bonus just doesn't actually apply to the Treasury Board policy of how bonuses are provided. It doesn't. So I follow those policies of the employer, and others may have views about those policies.
Thank you. That is your time. Turning now to Ms. Yip, you have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
I'd like to thank the Auditor General and her team for this very thorough work on this audit, and it is very tragic that it is the fourth time since 2003 that your office has raised these same issues, and it's no longer enough to accept recommendations, but we need to see real action and accountability take place. So my first question is, why were this is to Ms. Wilson, why were the formulas used by ISC and CMHC, and also Mr. Tremblay, you can jump in as well, to allocate funding to regional offices based on 2001 census data?
We don't use outdated census data at Indigenous Services Canada.
Okay. Mr.
The formula is based on a tripartite agreement that we've reached with Indigenous Services Canada and the First Nation Assembly of First Nations. We have not changed the formula over the years, but having said that, I will say that we are not going to unilaterally change that. You've seen we've agreed in the report that we will look and work with our partners to come up with a new formula, but we will not, in the spirit of reconciliation, unilaterally change the formula, so we will be working with our partners on that.
Also, I'm just puzzled in terms of the allocation of funds, which favored the First Nations with the most resources and allow them to submit the better projects. How did that happen? Why were communities that really needed the funding not addressed or prioritized first?
I can go. So in terms of the Residential Rehabilitation Assistance Program and the on-reserve nonprofit rental program, which is the focus of the auditor's report, as I mentioned, the allocation to provinces and regions are based on the formula you've mentioned, but from there, it's First Nations communities, tribal councils that decide the allocations, and they are the ones making the call on what they consider priorities and needs in their. And we think that is totally appropriate. They know best what their communities need.
I would just add our analysis that does demonstrate that we allocate and prioritize communities with the poorest conditions. I'd also add we only partially accepted the Auditor General's recommendation there because we didn't agree with the methodology the AG used to come to the conclusion that First Nations with the poorest housing conditions receive the least funding. And it's a matter of methodologies, it's a matter of different approaches. Ultimately, when we explore this again with our partners, we will defer to that process and we'll happily bring the Auditor General's methodology, we'll bring our methodology and any other options, and we'll develop that with First Nations.
Ms. Hogan, did you want to comment on that?
Well, I will ask Glenn to jump in for sure. I mean, what we did was look at the communities that had 100 housing units or less, and they had self-assessed that when there was 75% or more homes in the community that were in need of major repair, we put them in the poorest bucket, and the others had less than 75% of their houses needed to be replaced or major repair. And when we look at the average over all of those communities, it was clear to us that those with the poorest conditions, so more than 75% of their homes needing repair, received on average less funding than communities of similar size. I don't know if there's more detail that you would like that maybe Glenn could provide about our determination of that.
Mr. Chair, just to add to the Auditor General's point, the data that we use was pulled from the Department's Community Infrastructure and Housing Annual Report. So it was the Department's own data on the state of housing in communities. And just to, I guess, add a broader point, I think this finding ties in nicely to our finding on capacity, which shows that smaller First Nations often don't have the capacity to manage housing that larger First Nations have. So it ties into the importance of working with communities that do have greater needs to increase their capacity to manage housing. Mr. Chair.
Then I also recall in the report that a housing manager was provided for those with larger housing populations than those with smaller communities and perhaps with greater need.
Mr. Chair, I can just speak a bit about the housing subsidy program that we announced this year in Budget 2022. It included $157 million to support housing managers on reserve and $66 million over 3 years, beginning this year, for training and certification and the provision of technical services. So I'm quite certain those First Nation housing managers will be trained and supported to fill out applications, reports as one of the functions of their jobs, and we're optimistic you'll see progress on that as it pertains to capacity and applications and so on for those with lower capacity. There are differentiated levels of capacity for sure in communities, and we see this as one way to address it.
Well, on that note, there's been a notable shift between the approach this government has taken compared to previous governments when it comes to programs and services for Indigenous peoples, and one more focused on self-determination. Can you give us a sense of how its approach to housing investments and programming has changed since 2015, and what are the next steps to further self-determination?
Thank you for the question. I would probably point to partnership as a response to that question. I think, as noted in the Auditor General's report, we were proud to work with the Assembly of First Nations and all First Nations in the establishment and the adherence of the 2018 Assembly of First Nations Housing and Infrastructure Strategy, and that was developed in partnership with First Nation, as to was the application and the formula for the aforementioned housing management subsidy. That was done in partnership. And I think, as Deputy Wilson mentioned in her opening remarks, ultimately the management of housing affairs is the purview and is the right of First Nations, and we are proud supporters of First Nations in those self-determined affairs and an investor in those affairs. And last year, the fiscal year that just ended just a few days ago, was the most ever that this department spent in infrastructure, and we are on track to spend more this year. Absolutely, the need is great, and absolutely we have work to do, and we thank the Auditor General for her report. However, I would say that the most significant change that we've seen from 2015 is one of partnership, and one of ensuring that the self-determined goals of First Nations is led by First Nations themselves. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. That is the time. Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair Desgagnés.
So now we'll turn to Ms. Sinclair Desgagnés. If you don't speak French, put in your earpiece. Mr. Sinclair Desgagnés, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome to all witnesses. Thank you, Madam Auditor General, for a very instructive report. If we summarize the situation, billions of dollars was spent on housing for Indigenous services over the past years, yet no results seem to be seen. Quite the opposite. In terms of repair work, we have a very slim majority of improvement, less than 1% over 15 years. And in terms of housing replacement, we can say that these billions of dollars, a lot of people can ask the following question, and people listening to us, and including the major stakeholders in the First Nations, they must be asking what this money was used for. Fundamentally, what we have to ask ourselves is, if we have the humility that we need to ask ourselves these questions, if we have to be able to ask ourselves questions about the approach that the federal government is using to resolve problems that are being experienced by the First Nations. The approach appears to be deficient or even harmful, and I would really like to hear, first of all, the Deputy Minister, who I'm looking at, speak about what she thinks about the approach used, and whether, yes or no, we can completely redefine from A to Z the approach that the federal government is using in order to put a stop to putting in money into areas where it's not being used properly, and use an approach where we can build capacity, an approach where the First Nations can themselves finance themselves their their housing that would be a less, not so much a colonial approach. I'd like to hear what you have to say on that. Thank you for your question. It's not only about additional funding to build more houses for the First Nations communities. There is growing adherence to the need for property ownership, and for more and more people who are living unreserved can pay for the cost of a house now with funding, or at least part of the cost of the house. And yes, there are citizens in the First Nations that need social housing, as in the rest of the country, because they don't have a sufficient income to become a property owner. But the infrastructure funding, but if I may, I'd like to interrupt you. My time is limited. I was talking about redefining the approach used by the federal government. We're not talking about financing leading to ownership. We want to sure. I'm always open to any recommendations and advice as to change or new policies. Notices and advice may lead to small change, but I'm talking about a drastic change in the approach that we're taking, because finally in Quebec we're looking at the figures, and there may be some solutions there. There are possibilities. Look at the First Nations group in Sackville. They work with SOCA. They work with the McConnell Foundation and other financial institutions. You talked about access to ownership, but they also talk about building their own houses. When you look at the figures, things are working better in Quebec, so why not change the paradigm? Why the federal government is like the good dad who sends them money so that the First Nations can get houses. We need to redefine our approach, and I apologize. Maybe we have to focus on the necessary capacity building. I agree with your proposal, and I'm open to any suggestions to lead to transformation in cooperation with First Nations or other organizations. For example, I'm open to ideas like that. But even, Madam Auditor General, do you think that there's a real will in the federal government to focus on capacity building in the First Nations? Or do you see an approach where we spend a lot of money with very few results? I would mention two aspects to answer your question. When we've had a dialogue with the communities during this audit, they said clearly that the engagement had improved, but it wasn't a real negotiations. Sometimes they feel that the federal government determined how much the pool of money or the approach that was to be used. The communities found that the approach whereby they had to make an application for a specific program very difficult. They didn't have I think that would be the first aspect of my answer. Secondly, the policies and practices of the government with respect to reconciliation, engagements with respect to the agenda of First Nations. So if the policies and practices don't change, it's very difficult to say, okay, we're going to deal with these new obligations. That's why we need to take a different approach instead of simply saying, okay, we have the programs, tell us what your demands are, send us an application. I think we need a different approach. Thank you very much.
For 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And as many members of the team who's present here today, you know I'm disappointed for the better part of my time in Parliament with what I have noticed to be a very real and very serious level of neglect for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. And to be very frank, I'm horrified and disgusted with some of the answers presented today. To use Indigenous people's very valid and legitimate right to self-determination as an excuse to not update a funding formula, for example, something as basic as that, you wouldn't imagine a First Nation out there that would oppose such an update. What First Nations out there would oppose the updating of a formula that would give them more money for the critical needs they have? That excuse, Mr. Tremblay, sorry, I cannot accept that a government would act that way. That is one of the most nefarious and deceitful things a bureaucracy could do to hurt a population, is to simply suggest that a trilateral discussion was made and it requires the consent of all parties in order to update a funding formula. My goodness, that is structural racism. When we speak about structural racism, that's how it looks. When communities where I'm from in Alberta are so dramatically underfunded that they'd only receive $19 million for housing, well, the Auditor General points out very rightly that if the formula was simply updated, if someone just took a look and said, you know what, there is an emergency of housing on First Nations communities. We all acknowledge that this is a tool, an easy tool we can use, not even the low-bearing fruit were options for CMHC or for Indigenous Services Canada. So I'm heartbroken. I'm absolutely heartbroken by this tragedy that continues to unfold in Canada, where First Nations have to continuously be blamed for their own housing needs. That's what I've reviewed the departmental plan submitted to this committee in relation to this study, and it simply suggests that, well, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People suggests that these people have the right to self-determination. That right to self-determination right now is being abused in order to justify the material losses of First Nations, Métis, Inuit people. That's simply unacceptable. And I know we're going to, in the end of this committee meeting, just like I said the last committee meeting, you're all going to go back, it's going to be business as usual, and the AFN will continue to raise the alarm. You spoke about self-determination. I want to thank the Steering Committee on Technical Services for Treaty 6, for Treaty 7, and Treaty 8 in the Alberta region, who've asked me to plead in some ways and demand answers and accountability for these really basic levels of extreme racism, I believe. The minister was mandated to develop a strategy to close the infrastructure gap by 2030. I believe you mentioned that report in 2018 to suggest that it was co-developed, and I accept that point. What I understand, however, is 2030 is only 6 years away. These nations, and part of the Treaty 6, Treaty 7, Treaty 8, want to know how is Canada intending to fund the closing of the gap that exists, and by 2030. They want to know how. They have no confidence in their ability to work with the government to get these things done. The AG herself said it's impossible, nearly impossible, to close the gap by 2030. In addition to that, by 2040, the AFN tells me that that number has increased. They've cited that by 2040, that gap will actually increase to $527.9 billion. This comes from the very same people you cited as being your co-development partners. Shameful. That's unbelievable that you would attempt to mislead this committee about the true intentions of the partners that you have. They did not. A good partner would not have done to them what they have experienced. The funding formula, Mr. Tremblay, we'll start there. How can you justify not updating the formula when you know that the Honour of the Crown disposes the government to act in the utmost good faith to their partners?
So, Mr. Chair, again, as I said, the agreement is with the Assembly of First Nations and Indigenous Services Canada and CMHC. I will point out that there is just a set amount of funding as well. So if the formula is changed, there will be winners and losers, and so the set dollars is still the same. And again, we are committed to continue the work, and as we said—
Will you update the formula?
We did mention in the report that we are working on with our partners to update the formula, yes.
Okay, thank you. That's an incredibly simple question. I can't believe I have to ask that question. Now, Mr. Chair, how much time do I have remaining?
40 seconds.
So in relation to the the Indigenous Service de-evolution process, does ISC recognize that the de-evolution process itself can in fact be harmful should there not be an agency, whether it's the First Nation or the department, that's able to actually monitor the material loss or material gain to their communities during devolvement?
That's an institution I'd be more than willing to hear more about. I'm not aware of a particular agency that. But
your agency is set to devolve.
You're talking about ISC devolving and transferring.
Yeah, and there's a loss of material wealth during that process. How do you explain that?
There's a loss of material. I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
Go ahead, Mr. Deja, you can ask it again.
I'll ask it. They're losing money because they've been asked to sign agreements that look at de-evolution, and they have lost the opportunity to have ISC, formerly INAC, continue to monitor their lost houses.
Okay.
So, you know what I'm saying? There's a
Yes,
gap there.
yeah.
That's why the gap's growing. It's because devolvement.
I get your question now, but I think we'll need more time to respond to it.
Of course.
Do you have a response? Oh, no, go ahead. I have a practice in this committee that if members get their questions before my time allotment, I do tend to allow witnesses to answer within reason, obviously.
Yeah.
I try not to cut
So we have
members off.
some good examples of where we could do that. So, Nelson?
Go ahead, please.
I appreciate the question, and thank you. In terms of transfer, we don't call it de-evolution. We call it in transfer Indigenous Services Canada. It's baked into the mandate of the department as part of the legislation. We currently have 13 active tables around transfer, and these are tables that are dictated and mandated by rights holders themselves. And so that process begins with assessing the gap, much like the work that we did with the AFN in determining what the gap is in the report that you cited earlier. So the example I think that we often refer to, and one that we've talked about at this committee before, is the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority. That was a partnership to understand the water needs of Atlantic First Nations, the regulatory gap, and also the funding needed. And there was direct funding support to the Atlantic First Nations Water Authority to the tune of $173 million in recognition of that work. So I wouldn't say transfer is about a way of exacerbating the gap. I think it's about, to your point,
cherry picking some of these examples is
now,
not
Mr.
appropriate.
Digital, you know the other side of my rule is if you ask a question after the time is allotted, I tend to end things. But I suspect this line will be picked up by other members here, so I'm going to end it there. We'll begin our second round. Mr. Veerson, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here. Minister Haidu likes to blame previous governments for a lot of the failures, but 2 years ago, she in 2022. Here I'll quote her. Unfortunately, successive governments have not prioritized housing for Indigenous peoples. As a result, Indigenous peoples are more likely to live in overcrowded homes, experience higher rates of all kinds of challenging, including mold and other poor housing conditions. That was just about on the nose of 2 years ago. In the Auditor General's report, we have heard that the mold strategy seems to be completely forgotten, completely abandoned. However, it seems that the minister seemed to know about it at least 2 years ago. Could ISC explain why there's no action happening on the mold front and why they don't seem to be worried about it?
Well, Mr. Chair, there is action on mold, and there was a mold strategy. It was replaced by the current programming, which does allow for mold remediation. So mold remediation is underway, and Dr. Wong can talk about some of the efforts there. And it doesn't. We've seen that it was preferable in the spirit of self-determination to include the funding for mold directed to communities so they decide their priorities.
Was it ever communicated to the public that the mold strategy was being abandoned in lieu of something else?
Wasn't formally communicated to the public. It was worked through with First Nations.
Okay, so it still shows up on your departmental plans. Is there any efforts to do something differently?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I will make my remarks first and then turn over to Nelson Barbosa, my colleague, who's responsible for housing funding, including repairs and remediation for mold. Molds, from a health standpoint, it's a major concerns from a public health standpoint.
I understand that. I'm going to just move on from I'd just like to go back to the Auditor General, just if she could explain a little bit around, maybe I'm misunderstanding the change, and so if she could just clarify perhaps, did she understand that the program had been replaced by something else?
So our understanding when we were doing the audit is that no one could explain to us why the mold strategy wasn't being used anymore, and that access to funding to deal with mold is part of a bigger, broader repairs program that exists there. Now, this is an issue that my office raised in 2003, which recommended the creation of the strategy. I think strategy or no strategy, it comes back to understanding the magnitude of the mold issue so that it's properly, you understand the dollars needed and the support needed by communities in order to address it. And so whether you don't have a strategy or you have something else, you still need to understand the magnitude. And I think it goes back to first not having the data to know the extent of the problem, and then not having a plan to try and fund it and address it going forward, whatever you want to call it.
Okay. I was just wondering, how many employees does ISK have dedicated to housing?
Let me get that data for you here. Yeah, I think you have it. Yeah.
We can provide the committee more specific numbers, but I can say in Budget 22, Indigenous Services Canada received $2.4 billion for programming related to housing remediation in First Nations, and associated with that money was, it's with that money was 77 employees. Okay. $2.4 billion equaled 77 employees.
Okay. Do you know how long it takes to build the average housing unit through ISK?
It can vary greatly. And typically, these happen seasonal in the summer season, and which links into winter roads. So typically, that happens within a year.
Okay. Per unit, it takes a whole year to produce one unit.
It varies greatly. The one unit is a measure of a geospatial home, but some houses are small, some are big, some take a year, some take longer.
Some take 2 months.
Yeah. There are some that are prefab that happen immediately. Communities are using technology like 3D printing, which happens much faster. That is their prerogative.
What number does ISK use for the population growth of the folks that use service?
Sorry?
What is the number of what number for population growth are you using?
Yeah, so we use Statistics Canada data through the census and most recent census data.
Thank you very much. That is the time. Ms. Bradford, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses today. This question is for both ISC and CMHC. How often do your staff go out to inspect these sites to see the condition and how the progress is coming along?
I would say with our funding services officers that liaise quite daily with First Nation communities, along with our regional housing managers and regional infrastructure staff, we're looking at a daily kind of ongoing engagement that is quite fluid but very close.
Maybe I could just add, so all of our contribution agreements that include this type of funding do require final completion reports that are certified by a qualified inspector. And so we've been working with the First Nations National Building Officers Association to build that capacity as well as to do training and those sorts of things. Thanks.
So the AG's report identified that there was limited assurance of compliance with building code standards, that they lacked the necessary supporting documentation, and that CMHC did not require proof of building code compliance for housing repair programs. Why would that be?
That all of our programs on reserve, the two programs subject to the audit, are actually the parameters of the programs do require an inspections to be done. We, for the new constructions, you also have to take into account that the period under the audit was during a global pandemic where travel was restricted. So a 90% achievement is a very good rate in our opinion. The other thing I would say is that First Nations communities have no benefit of building and having non-standard or non-code compliant repairs or new builds done. And I can pass it to my colleague who can give you additional information if the chair allows.
Thank you for the question. So for our programming, we have quite an extensive inspection process for all new builds and repairs. And the same building inspectors that led to the 90% return rate on building code compliance for new construction are the same inspectors that we use to do inspections on repairs. And our agreement with them requires that the repairs that they are inspecting meet building code requirements. And so we have not, in a paper form, received that confirmation from them, but our contract with them requires that. And so we do feel that even though, and we will get that written confirmation going forward, but even though we didn't have that during the period of the auditor's report, we do believe that all those repairs met building code standards.
Going back to the mold problem, what are the underlying causes for mold? Why is this so prevalent? There must be an answer to that.
In this large country of Canada that has many aspects of deficit weather that impact its housing stock, the issue of mold is more prominent in First Nation communities due to the significant overcrowding that exists, as well as the harsh weather, particularly in remote northern communities.
All right. Now, also, you were talking before about the shift to more focused on self-determination. So how has the shift to a First Nations-led approach been playing out in the community? And are there any examples that come to mind that illustrate the difference now that this shift is taking place?
Thank you very much for the question. So I would say that part of it is ISK being a partner at the table, but being one of a number of partners, because there is no way that any one party can solve this issue alone. So we see lots of examples where, for example, in Alberta, we see Synovus as an example, dedicating $50 million to building housing in 4 First Nations and 2 Métis communities that are located around their operations. ISK has helped to support that project by providing over $5 million for enabling infrastructure, so lot servicing, subdivision development, engineering supports, those types of things to enable those houses to be built. So it's that type of partnership where we are supporting the nation in building those economic relationships with other parties and exploring monetization. Chippewas of the Thames, for example, now has a mortgage program on reserve. So as the deputy mentioned earlier, so that those who are interested in owning a home and entering into a mortgage relationship can do so, which traditionally has not been done on reserve. So there's a lot of groundbreaking work that is happening, acknowledging, of course, that there is so much work left to do, but trying to change that paradigm of funding going out kind of 100% upfront to do a build in, say, 2 months over the summer, but looking at ways to kind of extend that and take advantage of the money markets and those types of things. Thank you.
Thank you. That is the time. Suivant, c'est Madame Sinclair Desgagnés. Vous avez la parole pour 2 minutes.
Ms. Sinclair Desgagnés, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before going back to the approach where you confirmed that we have to completely change the approach, I have a question about funding. Your table in 2.5 of the report, the funding which was provided over the past 15 years does not seem to jive with the Indigenous population. Do you know why? Was this funding based on needs, and why is it always underfunded? So in the table that you mentioned in the report, when we saw that the CMHC was not using the information from an up-to-date census, or which didn't consider the last 20 years in demographic change, well, the underfunding, it can be explained there. So it's tied to the formula. Thank you. Mr. Tremblay, can you answer that? Is there an explanation is there a logical explanation? As I mentioned earlier, the formula is part of a tripartite agreement with First Nations, ISK, and CMHC, In our answer to the AG's report, we mentioned that we are going to work on changing this formula, and we will not do this unilaterally. Going back to the change in approach that's required, I'd like to hear Ms. Wilson. The AG said that we need to change our approach. It has to be a drastic change. Ms. Wilson, you have been in your position for a long time. You don't have any elections that you have to worry about, so you could think long term. So it's up to you to think about the changes that are required, total changes that are required. Thank you.
That I've been in the position, but certainly appreciate the question. Et comme j'ai dit, je suis très ouverte des
And as I said, I'm very open to change. I'm a real admirer of Chef Lance Hamiman and from Abscan, I believe. It's an initiative to give loans to people on reserves. For example, me, I'm now able, I have the means to buy my own house. And there are people who live on the reserves who have the means required to take out a mortgage.
Explore is home ownership on reserve by First Nations people. I can afford a home, but I don't have the right financing tools. So financing tools is a hope. Not everyone agrees with that. Il y a certaines qui n'est pas.
Some people don't have the same opinion, but that's my opinion. Thank you.
Suivant, up next, Mr. Desjardins, you have the floor for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll begin with a quote. They're asking us to take on liabilities that they create by chronic underfunding and leaving infrastructure on reserve to rot. And now they want us to take over with no commitments for ongoing operations and maintenance. I'm sure you could probably guess who said that. Many would wonder, of course, which First Nations. Almost any of them could make a very similar statement, I'm certain. But this comes from, again, the Treaty 6, Treaty 7, and Treaty 8, who you've cited as being a partner toward reconciliation, and it's your responsibility to ensure that transfer, Mr. Barbosa made mention, rather than de-evolution, transfer of responsibility. But this position you're taking is causing harm. And I hope that you understand that. The convenient excuse to take a very legitimate expression of an Indigenous nation's right to self-determination should not, and albeit must not, result in the material loss to First Nations communities. But that's the fact. Even worse, the trust between ISC, the Crown, and Indigenous people has gotten worse. They go on to suggest that they don't even know what are the priorities of this government. What is Canada's priorities for First Nation? Is it housing on reserve? Is it eliminating drinking water advisories? Is it to prevent reoccurrences? Is it First Nation infrastructure? They don't know because you're not acting. You're waiting with your hands, waiting for someone else to raise their hand and say, we need help. That isn't the approach that First Nations deserve. That is not the approach that Indigenous people in this country are entitled to. They deserve a government that acknowledges their responsibility to the treaties, first and foremost. If you needed an example of what transfer of responsibility looks like, look at the treaties of our ancestors that made very clear how these things were to be done. But instead of acknowledging the relationship that First Nations people have largely demanded of the Crown, the Indian Act, Indigenous Services Canada Act, have displaced much of that responsibility to your ministry. And now your ministry is saying we can't until the First Nations do these things. What is it going to take to ensure that not only money, but fair treatment and understanding their concerns is truly met? We'll start with Mr. Tremblay, particular to the formula.
So, Mr. President, again, the formula, as I mentioned, is part of our tripartite agreement, and we've committed to reviewing the formula as part of the response to the auditor's report.
But why didn't you do that before?
Mr. Desjardins, I'll tell you what, your time is up, but I think you wanted an answer from someone else.
I did, but I do want to just
No, yeah, you're past it. You're kind of in a catch-22 here.
Sure.
So you can come back to that, but we will hear from Ms. Wilson. So I'll meet you halfway.
Please,
Ms. Wilson,
please.
Mr. Chair, we are certainly not taking the position to transfer programs and services where First Nations are not well equipped and well supported and well funded to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up, we have Mr. Brock joining us. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. My sole question will be to Indigenous Services officials. I have one question. I am the member for Brant. I proudly represent 2 Indigenous nations, 6 nations of the Grand River, Mississaugas of the Credit. I trust at least someone on this panel has probably visited my riding from time to time. So I want to talk about an issue that has been plaguing my tenure as a parliamentarian, as well as my predecessor, Mr. Phil McColman. I wrote a letter to Minister Haidu on December 21st, 2001. It read, "The Gawaweni School is a federally funded elementary and secondary school located on 6 nations of the Grand River Territory. For the past 30 years, the school has provided instruction to its students in the Mohawk and Cayuga language in grade 8, at which time English is introduced. There has been an application for funding in progress for several years for a new school to be built. The school is currently operating out of a privately owned lacrosse arena, and their need for a new building is urgent. The landlord has been extremely accommodating. However, the lease is subject to annual renewal. Therefore, the space is not secure and, most importantly, certainly not adequate for a school. The classrooms are cramped with no running water, and the majority do not have windows. The language instruction not only provides the students with an education, but also the foundation for their identity. No doubt you will agree that providing financial support for the construction of the school will also help to fulfill our collective commitment towards truth and reconciliation, most specifically the preservation and revitalization of Aboriginal languages and cultures. Minister, in short, the current facility is not acceptable and, more importantly, not safe for the students and staff. They have been without a proper school for over 30 years. It's been long enough. The school has the support of 6 Nations Council and a shovel-ready project which should be funded. I look forward to your reply." Well, I didn't get a reply. I had to follow up with Minister Haidu on April 22nd, 2022, reminding her that my staff reached out to her office on March the 10th, 14th, and 28th with no response. This project is now just under $30 million to properly fund. When we were asking for federal funding, the cost was just over $10 million. Because of Justin Trudeau's inflationary policies, we have now almost tripled the cost. Justin Trudeau has spent close to $21 billion on consultants, but can't seem to find the money to fund this particular school. Today, I had the chair, Ruby Jacobs, crying to my constituency office saying, what does it take to finally get the Government of Canada to recognize the need to introduce this school, to have the funding there, to have the school learn in a proper environment? What are you going to tell my constituents? What are you going to tell the parents of the children? What are you going to tell the chair who is crying? When are we going to receive the funding?
So thank you for the question, and I am aware of the situation, and I will certainly follow up with
Not good enough.
my colleagues in education.
We've been waiting for 7 years for this government to write a check. That is not an appropriate answer. When are they going to receive funding? 3 years ago, actually 2.5 years ago, Minister Miller attended on site. We had the press there. We had all kinds of stakeholders there. We were thinking that Minister Miller was going to deliver that long-awaited check. All that Minister Miller had to say was, "I'm sorry, I don't have the best news for you. Be patient. We are working on it. There are other priorities in our department, but you will eventually receive the funding." That was almost 2.5 years ago. When will you write the check?
It's not my check to write, but I will follow up with the officials under whose program this fits. We do run schools at Six Nations. That is not the only school in at Six Nations.
Why doesn't your minister, this is to Ms. Wilson, why doesn't your minister, Minister Haidu, have the professional courtesy to respond to members of Parliament who are duly elected to represent a number of Indigenous nations? Why do I have to plead and beg for a response? This is shameful, it is disgusting, and I hope you relay the message directly to her, how disappointed I am in the way that she conducts her ministry. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brock. Turning now to Ms. Shanahan. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. And yes, if we can get back to the study. But good to hear that all members here, I think, of all parties are in agreement that this is a very tragic situation, decades of underfunding that have resulted in First Nations being underserved in housing, and I would hope to see my Conservative colleagues voting with us when we're allocating money to First Nations housing. To the CMHC, one of the main objectives of this government, because there certainly are a number of programs dedicated to housing, and even though I'm a former banker and pride myself in being knowledgeable about the different financing arrangements, it can be quite complicated and difficult to follow. But it could be, and I'd like to hear from the CMHC and then Indigenous Services as to how First Nations are able to access the numerous programs that are available for housing, and how are you working with the First Nations to facilitate and certainly increase the capacity of First Nation communities to access the different programs? Off the top, Ganawage is a neighbor of my riding. It's not within my riding, but if they had a housing project that they want to do, what would be the first step that they would take?
In the National Housing Strategy does prioritize Indigenous people and people living in the North as one of their priority populations. So as of December 31st, 2023, I'm happy to say that we've committed $6 billion of the $43 billion that has been committed under the National Housing Strategy to Indigenous people and people living in the North. How we go about helping them navigate the various programs, it's actually my colleague Morley who heads that Indigenous Solutions team that is across Canada. So they do meet with First Nations and other Indigenous groups to help them navigate the programming and also help them with applications. In terms of building capacity, we do have an internship program that is quite successful that we fund every year, and we've also helped stand up the First Nation Housing Professionals Associations, and they are able to build capacity of First Nations as well, including we were talking about mold remediations earlier, Mr. Chair, so including in that area. So we are doing what we can. Morley, I don't know if you'd want to add anything.
No, I think you covered it very well. We have a team across the country of front-facing staff who go out into the communities and meet with the housing managers and or whoever is managing the housing portfolio on a First Nation reserve. And we have great relationships, and we help wherever we can with respect to capacity building, but also filling out applications, processing applications, advocating for First Nations, all those things.
Could you talk to me about the Housing Accelerator Fund? Is that something that First Nations communities have access to?
So Mr. Chair, there was a portion of the Housing Accelerator Fund that was dedicated to rural and northern areas. So we did have successful First Nations actually apply through the Housing Accelerator Fund, in fact.
Have you seen as successful? What would be the rate of uptake? Is that making a dent in facilitating the construction of housing on reserve?
The program, as you know, just recently went through the application process and is successful, so it's a little early, but we can get back to the committee in terms of success on First Nations on reserve.
OK. Et je peux dire que chez nous,
in Chateauguay and L'École, we had some success with the Rapid Housing Initiative. It was a partnership between OSPL in Chateauguay with an agent in Kanawaki. Are there other types of programs like that one? Do you see other partnerships occurring, particularly in the urban area?
Mr. Chair, sorry, the Rapid Housing Initiative was one of the most successful programs in terms of building houses quickly or committing to building housings quickly. And I think the take-up rate for Indigenous was around 40%, if I'm not mistaken, of the total $4 billion of funding.
Thank you very much. That is your time, I'm afraid. Beginning with our next round, Mr. Smale, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. I want to talk actually more along the lines that our block colleague was going, and that relates to outcomes. How are we measuring outcomes?
I'll let my colleague talk a little bit about what we have in our departmental performance reports as identified for outcomes.
Thanks. I think, thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. We measure outcomes in two ways. One is was cited as part of the opening remarks in terms of houses built and renovated, and that number across the two departments in front of you today eclipses 30,000. The other way we measure progress is around overcrowding metrics and metrics related to household density. So those are markers of indicators of progress.
And when you look at the population numbers, what stats are you using? From what year?
Within Indigenous Services Canada, we've applied the 2021 census data. Thanks.
Okay. Now, what policies are you using currently to empower Indigenous communities to chart their own course, if you will?
So I mentioned earlier where we invested $223 million in housing managers, but more work is still needed here. There was also additional funding provided for training, certification, and ensuring those housing managers had the capacity to manage, even technical capacity and expertise to manage housing on reserve.
So we have had a number of reports recently over the years that talk about the fact that spending is up in these departments, but outcomes are not necessarily growing with the increased funding. First of all, why? But second, what is the department doing to fix this, and at what point can we see an increase in the amount of actual results? It could be we'll talk about housing here. We're talking about housing.
So the outcome for housing has been 34,000 houses built, but I get what you're saying. I understand the complexities in all of this, and I'll ask Nelson to reply.
It is an excellent question. I think 30,000 homes renovated or built is certainly a marker of success, but there's work to do. Maybe I'll point to some other success areas, and I'll reference since 2016, First Nations themselves reported an average community well-being score of 58, and in 2022, that average rose. In 2016, First Nations reported an average community well-being housing score as 68, and in 2021, that rose. In 2016, there were 17 First Nations that reported community well-being scores less than 40, and in 2021, that number is 2. Additionally, the number of homes, as self-reported by First Nations, grew by 4%, and the number of adequate homes grew by 6%. So we're seeing progress. I think there's a way to go. Thank you for the question.
Maybe to the Auditor General, who has had a few reports on this, basically outlining the same concerns and the same problems. Are you seeing that same level of attention to this problem?
And
Are you talking about closing the gap?
Yes, and do you agree with the assessment you just heard?
So the funding that has been spent has definitely contributed to building new homes. We actually have an exhibit that talk about the achievement of that. We highlight that, in the report when they were looking at the gap, it was about 55,000 homes, I believe, that needed to be built. Here we are, 5 years later, almost 6 into it, and 80% of that is still remaining. So it means that 20% was built. So there's definitely progress. I guess my biggest concern is that this is a large gap, and it's a lot of money, and so you should have a plan to know how to fund that investment. It can't all be funded on day one, right? So there needs to be a plan to know how to fund that investment. There will be limited funding every year, and that's why looking at equitable allocation, increasing access to funding for some communities that don't already have it, is one of our recommendations. Really going after those further behind and trying to bring them forward first is the spirit of many of the recommendations that we have here. But it starts with understanding the whole quantum of the issue, and then having a plan to fund it going forward. But I do want to acknowledge that progress has been made, but will this gap be closed by 2030? In my view, unlikely, given how the few years left and 80% of the needs are still largely unmet.
So now we talked about this gap that probably won't be closed. It was mentioned earlier about that new approach, right? If we're just relying on program funding, it doesn't seem to be actually getting the outcomes that I think all of us want. Where do you see the change needing to be made, and how much of a new approach would you think would be necessary? Are we looking at a total overhaul in thinking? Are we talking about more capacity for First Nations themselves in terms of their own ability to monetize, that type of thing, to reach the goals that they need to achieve for their people?
I see Mr. Chair is looking to say the time is done, and I guess I'll answer it quickly, and yes, all of the above, right? A fundamental shift means to really think about things in a different way, but to continue to say, well, we have X number of programs for housing, apply to those individually over here. We have X number of programs for safe drinking water, apply to those over here, is the siloed approach that, in my view, after decades, we're not seeing is working effectively for communities overall.
Thank you very much, Mr. Collins. Thank you for joining us today. You have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks for having me, Mr. Chair, and welcome to our witnesses. Mr. Trombley, maybe I'll start with you. I think I read in a theme I think that developed in the report from the Auditor General was one of almost the haves and the have-nots. And the smaller communities, I think, were at a disadvantage in terms of accessing funding either through the department or through your organization for various reasons, and they're highlighted in the report. I've always found that many of CMHC's programs are urban-centric. I come from a large municipality. I served on our nonprofit housing board, and we have a team of lawyers, planners, and others who help us with applications that you put in place. And for small rural communities and northern and remote, and in this instance, Indigenous communities, they don't have those resources, and so many choose not to apply. So can I ask what your organization is doing to ensure that for small communities, and I think the term that was used in the report was application-based proposals penalize those without resources. What's your organization doing to change that narrative to ensure that the smallest of communities who deserve their share of the resources from all of those who are in attendance here today, how are you changing things in your workplace to ensure that they have equal access to those resources?
So thank you, Mr. Chair. So as I mentioned, we have a dedicated team that is across the country that works with Indigenous, First Nations, and other Indigenous housing, including remote areas and in the north. The National Housing Strategy also has $1.6 billion that's dedicated to Indigenous people and people in the north. So as I mentioned, Mr. Lindsted's team is around the country and helps them with applications. We've also tried to build capacity as we're doing this. So if a First Nation is doing their first application, Mr. Lindsted's team can help them. And once they've gone through an application for a program, they then can get better at being able to have the capacity to apply further. I will also say that a lot of our programs are across, obviously, it's the National Housing Strategy covers the whole the whole continuum and the whole country. And as I said, even though a lot of these programs are applications based, thanks to the work of Morley's team, we've been able to get a lot of applications through funding through these applications program. As I mentioned, the numbers around 12 to 13% of the overall NHS funding that's been committed to date.
Thank you. Something I didn't see in the report was the cost of providing housing. There's references there that talk about the challenges that Indigenous communities have in rural and remote communities in terms of transportation issues, servicing issues. I think they're referred to as essential services in the Auditor General's report. And your organization is driving innovation in the housing sector. You have an innovation fund that seeks to accomplish that. Rapid Housing Fund, I think, has poured millions, tens of millions of dollars into modular housing, which every time that happens, it's driving innovation in that sector. What is your organization doing to assist Indigenous communities with lowering the cost of housing, where in some instances it can be almost double the cost of what we're paying for in urban areas?
So, Mr. Chair, I think the member has mentioned a lot of the initiatives that we have put in place to help with that. Modular housing is, and we've mentioned 3D housing is a very good step towards lowering the cost. Obviously, you've mentioned some of the barriers that exist. The other one being it's very seasonal for the Indigenous people that live up north or in more rural areas. So access becomes an issue. So we are working, as you said, with the affordable initiation, the modular housing. So we're looking at different ways to help communities build housing faster and cheaper.
Thank you. Ms. Wilson, can I ask about the infrastructure, the essential services? It's oftentimes a shared responsibility between three levels of government, including First Nations governments, in terms of the resources that they have to contribute to upgrade the same. Provincially, is there a plan with our provincial partners when it comes to water, wastewater services, when it comes to building new roads to get to these rural and remote communities where climate change has played a role in terms of creating barriers, whether it's low water levels that don't allow the shipment of goods, whether it's ice roads that are no longer there during the winter season? Are our provincial partners contributing, and what's the plan in terms of addressing financial issues with those partners where they may not be at the table currently?
It's a great question. They are engaged to varying extents, I would say. Certainly when it comes to roads and winter roads, we have a lot of conversations with our partners, but maybe I'll check with Joanne to see if there's anything in particular.
Yeah, maybe a couple of examples. So in New Brunswick, for example, Tobic First Nation has an agreement with the provincial government for a $22 million investment. We've, again, similar to the example I mentioned earlier in Alberta, we've supplemented that, particularly around, again, lot servicing, engineering, those types of things. And the intent there is to build 50 homes with that partnership approach. So as the deputy said, it's not even, there's not a program to which people apply, right? These are ongoing discussions and dialogue between nations in a nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationship. Thank you.
Okay. I think my last question would be around the whole issue related to those small communities that don't have capacity right now to not just manage, but to apply for the programs that Mr. Tremblay talked about. Are there small communities that have raised those issues in terms of even being provided the resources that you've highlighted today that are available to them? Some may choose that or say that they're not capable because they just don't have the population to manage it. Can I ask what the plan is? Is it a regional approach that it will be taken by First Nations where, much like regional governments we see in rural areas, take a collective control over some of the issues that you're dealing with?
It's a very regionally based approach. I would say when it comes to things like filling out applications, 6 out of 10 provinces in our sphere, there is no application. So it's people working with people, committees, regional funding formulas, regional decisions that are made in partnership with First Nations. And that's just how it works at the local level. So but there are reports, there are things that we can probably streamline and do better when it comes to some of the paperwork. So appreciate the question.
Thank you very much. Suivant, c'est Madame Saint-Claude-Gagné. Je vais vous donner 3 minutes.
I'll give you 3 minutes. So we'll have a little bit more time than I initially thought, so you'll have 3 minutes. Thank you. I had the I heard that you agree, Mrs. Wilson, that radical change, a change in paradigm is required. These are all big words, so I would imagine that with your meeting with the minister after the release of the report was quite tumultuous, because we can see that radical change is needed. How did it go? How did this meeting go with the minister? She had the same feeling. We have consultations with respect to organizations and infrastructure. I will turn my floor over to my colleague very briefly, please, because I have a lot of questions.
First Nations rights holders specifically on this question of why so many programs, how to modernize, how to monetize, and how to bring more modern municipal practices to the First Nation environment.
Concrètement, pratique moderne, est-ce que vous parlez juste...
In concrete terms, are you talking about building capacity, and instead of just sending money out where there's no results?
But ultimately, it comes down to choice. And we have many programs. We have one housing program, but we have a water program, a school program, and sometimes those don't align with the needs of a community. So the community should be empowered to choose where those investments go based on the investments that are available.
Donc, enfin, un peu de liberté de...
So, finally, a little bit of freedom of choice for the communities. They can decide where the money goes. That's a step ahead. I'll agree with that. But is it enough? That's my next question. To go back to my original question about the reaction of the minister, yes, restructuring is required. Will there be any changes in the budget? Because it's urgent, and we have to take quick action to completely change the way we deal with this whole issue.
Of appropriations is a parliamentary question, but I would say we were happy to work with the Assembly of First Nations in quantifying the infrastructure gap. We engaged First Nations for over a year on understanding what the delta was in infrastructure, quantifying that gap, and working with the AFN to cite the report that was published on April the 9th. And so we know that the gap is great. We have programs that we will fund at the highest level housing this year. We will fund water at the highest level.
C'était pas exactement la question.
That wasn't exactly my question. I'm asking you a practical question. In the budget that will be announced next week, will we finally see major changes in the way that the federal government finances various programs, or we're going to have to wait a few years for another report to come out in order for these changes to occur?
Positive budget outcomes on April 16th, and we want to continue to work with First Nations to bring that modern practice into place, including the monetization of investments.
Excusez-moi, mais vous venez...
You've just said that you have a hope, but we're not talking about hope. You're the one who's going to define your requests when you talk to the minister. The deputy minister is, if she's not able to say, yes, there will be major change in the budget, that would mean that finally we would be aware of the various reports, lamentable reports that we've had, and it begins with a budget. So, and you're not able to tell me whether it'll be the case. And if that is the fact, then we've got a real problem here.
I would agree that the budget appropriation cycle is critical in closing the infrastructure gap, and like you, we eagerly wait for the results of April the 16th.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup. Next up, Mr. Desjardins, you have 3 minutes. I looked left when I should have looked right when Mr. Smale was speaking. He went over slightly. I gave Mr. Collins more time. I've done the same for the Bloc. So you have 3 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I do now want to just ask the Auditor General, in light of our discussion here today, you heard many of our questions, you heard our concerns, and in your own experience as our Auditor General, you've cited many times, not just in your own words, but in previous comments by other Auditor Generals, to just the lengthiness of this crisis. The length and the time in previous testimonies, you've said this is going to impact an entire generation. And as a matter of fact, it has. Could you comment on what you heard, and are you hopeful with what you've heard, not just in the response to your recommendations, but also here today, that the gap will be closed by 2030?
So I stand by our comments in our report that I believe it's unlikely the gap will be closed by 2030 unless something drastically different is done in the next, there's almost 7 years to go. So, something different really needs to happen. And it starts with understanding the gap and then having a plan to move forward and doing that with communities. I mean, I would be happy to come back one day and say all of these recommendations didn't get acted on because there's something completely different, and here's what's happening now, versus just continuing to say there's been little progress made on our recommendations.
When it comes to program failures, and you review many programs and you see failures often, and you see sometimes there's changes in those in that work. We've seen multiple decades now of this ministry in particular saying they're going to do the right thing, and then they don't. As a matter of fact, in your report, you suggest not only that they won't reach the target by 2030, but it's actually getting worse. We see from the Assembly of First Nations report, for example, that the number that they had even co-developed with the ministry in 2018, the number they came up with is now outdated because of inaction. And now that number's well over $520 billion in terms of infrastructure gap. My concern, and I think Canadians' concern, and I think Indigenous people across the country are concerned with how do we in fact get a ministry like Indigenous Services Canada, which on one side is asked to transfer the responsibilities to Indigenous people, while also attempting to hit these really incredible targets like closing the infrastructure gap by 2030. How can they make such bold claims when they're saying it's someone else's problem? Do you see a disjoint or a silo in your words?
I believe you're highlighting part of my concern that I mentioned in my opening remarks about the partial agreement with one of our recommendations, right? And that is, as I reflected on this work and on the work of my predecessors, to say there's been 20 years in this area with very little progress is why I am completely discouraged and why I believe we made recommendations to try and improve things within the current confines of policies and practices, but something fundamentally different is needed to change.
Is this the worst ministry you've ever audited?
That's a difficult answer to a question to
Top
answer.
three?
There are so many individual programs and that are not doing well. I would
Mr.
think,
Desjardins,
and then there are so many that are doing well. So it's a tough question.
I
to
will
answer,
Mr. rescue
Chair.
the auditor from ranking her greatest hits. If she's inclined to think about it, she can get back to us on that. Turning now to Mr. Nader, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to open just with a comment, mainly directed to the CMHC, and not to sound glib, but do better. I mean, do better. I mean, that's my comment to CMHC right now, specifically on First Nations housing and the fact that you're using data from 2 decades ago. Come on. Do better. And I know the Liberals brought up the Housing Accelerator Fund, and I'll go broader to that beyond First Nations housing. Rural communities, small town communities, did not benefit from the Housing Accelerator Fund. The fact that the township of Mapleton, a rural community in my riding, was lumped in as a large urban municipality, I mean, come on. It's ridiculous. Not a single rural small town in Perth, Wellington, and in many rural communities benefited from the Housing Accelerator Fund. So I just say that program is failing, and I think, unfortunately, CMHC is to blame in partnership with the Liberal government. But to the matter at hand, I want to begin with Ms. Wilson. Can you confirm for us whether you've done any investigation as to whether any employees in your department are also contractors with other government departments?
We are doing that investigation as we speak. Yes, it's underway.
And when will you have results from that investigation?
I want to say that it's in the next month, but I'd have to double check with you what the deadline. It's the government-wide deadline.
And will you provide those results specific to our committee when you're completed?
Certainly.
And the alternative, how many contractors within your department are also employees of other government departments?
We'll include that too.
I appreciate that. Going back to the mold strategy, and this has been brought up before, I want some precision on this. So when did Indigenous Services Canada make the conscious decision to stop following the 2008 mold strategy?
I'm going to take a guess here because this is before my time, but I'll look at my colleagues and I'll look at Dr. Wong here. It was not a decision made on a day. It was a gradual inclination by First Nations of wanting to reduce the silos of various program entities within and wanting more flexible funding. So gradually there was a move towards providing that flexibility and ensuring that mold was an expense that was completely available within the programming that we have.
But I think where the concern is, and I don't want to put words in the Auditor General's mouth, but I think she talked about the data being available. And when there's no longer a strategy specifically dedicated to this very serious concern that has been raised in multiple decades, frankly, the fact that there's no longer the strategy dedicated to that, where the data is found, where the data is dealt with, it's a concern. So again, I'm going to push back a little bit. When was this decision made? Why was this done?
I'll repeat, it was not a time and a date where a decision was made, but I would say that we do have environmental protection health officers that go in and provide testing, and they provide First Nations with reports upon a First Nation request. We actually make active offers to communities to allow our inspectors to go in and provide that, as well as prevention, awareness, and so on. But you do have a point about not knowing precisely and exactly what the extent of mold is, and I think that's something for us to take back as part of this audit and be able to talk to First Nations and say, actually ask the question on how we want to deal with that. Do we want precision on mold extent?
Well, and I would say to that, I will ask that question again. I will come back the next time you're before this committee to see what progress has been made specifically on that. I want to follow up about a survey that Indigenous Services Canada undertook in 2022, in which less than 10% of First Nations communities actually responded. Perhaps first to the Auditor General, what kind of concern would you place on the fact that so few communities, First Nations, actually responded to that survey?
I think it's difficult. There's always communities that don't want to respond to surveys. Like anywhere, you might receive requests for them in your inbox, and there's some you'll choose to respond to and some you'll choose not to. I think it highlights the lack of capacity to perhaps address something that is seen as not essential to the day-to-day for a community trying to deal with this. When we look at the survey results here, it was interesting in those that did respond was that so many of them don't have full-time dedicated housing managers, and I would tell you some of the smaller communities it's less than half that will have a dedicated resource, and it's a critical resource to wade through the application process, but even to just understand the issue and needs of a community.
Thank you. That is your time. I'm turning now to, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Diab. I want to make sure it wasn't a hyphenated name, but Ms. Diab, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Chair. It's nice to have another Atlantic Canadian as a chair on the committee. So I'm a member from Nova Scotia. And in Nova Scotia, we have 13 First Nations communities in my province who hold reserve lands. There's some fabulous examples in my province. If I speak of Member 2, I'm sure all of you must have heard of Member 2. They have a development corporation that has existed for a few decades now, and notably Chief Terry Paul is the head of the organization. I was present last year when he actually won the Excellence in Business Awards for Atlantic Canada. So I guess I'm not a member of this committee, and I sort of subbing in today. It's a very large, huge topic when we talk about housing. We know we have issues in housing all over the country, but here particularly when we talk about First Nations, is there a discrepancy in the gap between the different provinces or the different regions of Canada? I'd like to, for whoever is able to answer that, I'd just like to get an idea on that. And is there great examples that you can share or that can be shared with maybe some communities that are not doing as bad as, or that are actually doing really good things with the other parts of the country? So who can help me with those questions?
I can start.
And then if I have time, lastly, I'll ask it now. I'd like to understand a little bit from the doctor on this mold issue that keeps coming up here today, but only if I still have time. So please go ahead.
I'll give you two examples and leave time for Dr. Wong for sure in the Atlantic. And as proud Atlantic Canadian myself, the deputy mentioned one of them in her remarks earlier around service transfer. So the Confederacy of Mainland Mi'kmaq, that is a service transfer initiative that we have undertaken with them that is expected to be implemented in the 26-27 fiscal year. Also, there is a housing agency, First Nations housing agency, that's being developed by the Congress of Atlantic, the Atlantic Policy Congress of Chiefs. So there is a lot of governance work happening in Atlantic Canada, a lot of investment in developing the economy around this as well. So, for example, Abbotsford First Nation and PEI, close neighbor, they have also worked with both the federal and provincial governments to produce more housing, but also to start a company, a construction company run by the First Nation, bringing people home, having places for them to not only live, but live and work. And that is a huge shift in terms of building an economy that will enable the change that is needed to kind of shift the paradigms in terms of how housing and infrastructure is done on reserve. So with that, I'll turn it to Dr. Wong. Thank you.
Over time, there's been a decrease in the number of house inspections being identified by Indigenous Services Canada environmental public health officers. Started, a baseline of half of the houses, and I have to emphasize, half of the houses initially being identified as, with mold as an issue. And then 5 years later, there's been actually a decreasing number of houses and number of inspections down to less than a quarter. But still, less than a quarter, it's 1%. It's just too many. We'd like it to be down to less than 1%. And that goes back to the problem and the disparity and the inequities that need to be addressed. But part of that reason, the context of why there's been a decrease in those inspection of the number of home inspection with the molds is because of the existence, of programs from the housing sector, the housing programs with funding to actually support the renovations, the repair, as well as, the new builds, et cetera. From my perspective on the public health side, much more needs to be done. We need to drive down that from 25% to less than 1%. Thank you.
So, not an Indigenous issue, but when we talk of mold, I think, someone like me or anyone, I think sometimes it's awareness as well that it's an issue. It could exist in so many homes and people may not even be aware of that. So maybe, yeah. But in terms of the disparity in the different regions and the different provinces, does anybody can comment on that?
Oh, if I may, Mr. Chair, I think I would point the honourable member to a few of our exhibits. You have to sort of piece a few of them together. 2.1 will give you the split across the provinces of where there are First Nations communities and the housing units in that province. Then if you look to Exhibit 2.2, we'll show you the needs that need to be, the gap that needs to be closed. And then I would point you to Exhibit 2.5. While it is it looks at some of the programs around CMHC and not the two departments, it will show you that there were how many percentages of the housing units were in need of repair and those of replacement, and the underfunding or overfunding based on the issue with the data used in their formula. So I think it would give you a sense by province, if you looked at those exhibits together, where some of the gap is, so where the housing units are and where some of that gap is.
Thank you. I am expecting bells for votes. We're also nearing the bottom of the hour, the half hour. I'm going to propose a truncated time of 3 minutes for government and official opposition members, 90 seconds each for the Bloc and the NDP. I'll begin now, and I'll look for consent to continue. Doing this will take about 15 minutes. So if the consent's there, we'll continue. If not, we will have to pause when the bells go. To the Conservative side, what did we say it was? Mr. Schmale, you have the floor for just 3 minutes. And again, you can use the full 3 minutes or you can stop at any time before that. So you're under no obligation, but we are happy to hear from you for full 3 minutes. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Appreciate the full 3 minutes. Ms. Wilson, I want to pick up where you left off regarding the inspectors that go into individual communities and take a look at their housing needs. How many inspectors have been requested to go into community in the past year?
Wong, if he has that at the tip of his fingers.
Yeah, but back in 2017, 2018, approximately about 1,200 home inspection requests, were requested. And then 5 years later, it was during the time of COVID, and as we all know, during COVID, a lot of the requests have gone down for many, many different services, and that actually went down to close to 600. So it's almost like 50% reduction in the requests.
So these are the requests, but how many communities actually requested that?
It's the number of communities that have been requesting. That also has gone down as well.
So if it's 50%, there's 633 communities. It would be something like 300 and something.
So this is to continue on the overall theme about building capacity and getting away from endless program funding that doesn't seem to be working at all. How welcoming or how interested are some of these communities to having an agent of Ottawa coming on their lands to basically point out issues that department itself, unfortunately, had a part in not fixing?
You have a point. This is upon the First Nation request, and we won't go into communities unless they request the environmental protection health officer to come in. We try to make active offers. So these folks work regionally. So they're in Saskatchewan and they're in Alberta, and they're not in Ottawa.
As a First Nations woman yourself,
yes.
Like how interested would you have, an agent of Ottawa coming onto your land to explain problems that department was responsible for not fixing? Where is that capacity being built on reserve, where we can get to a point where we don't have to rely on Ottawa to get their act together before they can fix the issue on the ground?
Well, they're not in Ottawa, and as a First
You
Nation,
know what I meant. That was a figure of speech.
Okay, so as a First Nation woman, I'm actually happy to have resources wherever I can to provide support, advice for the safety and security of my community.
Additional comment regarding that. Also, as we speak, right now there's a new initiative, which is to try to recruit and retain Indigenous environmental public health officers. And currently, about 40% of the environmental public health officers are Indigenous. But with this new initiative, especially supporting Indigenous people who want to become one, have a laddering opportunities working with academic institutions in order to perform that.
How many would be living on reserve?
Thank you, Mr. Schmale. That is your time, but your side will have one more spot.
I got that in before you said that.
No, that's not how it works.
I think I got it in.
That's there. When you're past your time.
I want to challenge the chair.
You go right ahead. Ms. Yip, you have the floor for 3 minutes because I will be voting with the Liberals on this one, Mr. Schmale. So I'm sure I'll win that vote. Ms. Yip, you have the floor for 3 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Today I've heard repeatedly that much more needs to be done over and over. Okay, are we done there? Yeah? Okay, I'll start again. Today I've heard over and over again that much more needs to be done, and I see that both CMHC and ISK have submitted in action plans. And when I look at the action plans, I see that all the dates are 2025, 2026, and 2027, except for the building code line or recommendation is 2024. Can Mr. Tremblay and Ms. Wilson comment on that?
Mr. Chair, I had the same question when I looked at the action plans. One, for example, said that post-2027, we'd have to look at funding, and I was told, and it makes a lot of sense, that the budget 2022 allocations for the next number of years had already been allocated. So to actually go and change the allocation, we'll have to wait until that timeline. So that's just one example.
Mr. Chair, we are committed to, as I've said, to respond to the auditor's report and action plan, and we are going to do every effort to actually meet the deadlines and even exceed the timelines if we can.
Ms. Wilson, in your opening statement, you had mentioned a preliminary action plan. Is that different from what we see here?
Sorry, the preliminary action plan that was referenced in the deputy's opening comments is the one that was tabled with the committee. Yes.
Thank you. From Ms. Wilson, from your perspective, and also based on what you hear from First Nation partners, are some of these programs working?
Nelson talked about some of the community well-being index indicators, which I was pleased to see were actually going up when it comes to First Nations in a number of areas. I would hope that anyone would be open to looking at that presentation at some point on the Community Wellbeing Index, because it is quite promising, and I'm hopeful.
What are you hearing in terms of changes and improvements from the community?
Many communities are, when it comes to First Nations, very differentiated. Many communities are still in crisis. They're still suffering. There's still a lot of issues there. Many communities are evolving and moving forward, and you have communities like Membertou who are doing great and don't really need Indigenous Services Canada to be involved. So it's a whole gamut and a whole range and a whole continuum of communities.
Mr. Tremblay, this is in regards to the $4.3 billion urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy. Could you tell me more about this 10-year housing and infrastructure strategy?
So the housing infrastructure strategy, is actually from Indigenous Services Canada. The urban, rural, northern strategy is the strategy that the government will launch in this upcoming fiscal year to address urban, rural, and northern challenges for Indigenous people. And we are creating an Indigenous center that will monitor the bulk of the money.
Et voilà, merci beaucoup. Thank
or
you very
manage
much.
the bulk of the money. Sorry.
Suivant, c'est Madame Cycle Desgagnés.
Miss, you have 90 seconds. Thank you. I'd like to go back to a previous point. We have to be very careful since the current government's been in power for 8.5 years. And we've read the conclusions of this report, and we've looked at the percentage of houses with mold. Maybe people are... I think that with the conclusions that are so devastating in this report and that we've read in other previous reports, I think we have to really look at, as was mentioned, there are major changes that have to take place. Ms. Wilson, I'd like you to concentrate on this. There will be more space given to self-determination. That's good. Self-determination is very important for me. Then there's a whole question of the programs working in silo. You have to give communities an opportunity to decide where the funding is to go. I'd like to hear your opinion on that.
Refer to in 5 seconds is this infrastructure modernization initiative that we're moving forward on. It's a game changer. Merci.
Comme 30 secondes presque.
Donc, on s'attend qu'avec ces changements-là, vous...
So with these changes, you're confident that you're going to be able to fulfill the objectives by 2030?
We have a national strategy that is looking at a 10-year work plan at this very moment. It was mentioned by the member before. I would work towards and continue to work towards meeting that timeline and that target. It's going to take more than the money. It's going to take financing tools. It's going to take a lot of work.
Ça prend surtout une question de volonté parce qu'on voit que si des
And a question of will. If this is such a devastating report, it's perhaps there's been a lack of confidence by successive governments in resolving these problems. Thank you very much.
Next, Mr. Desjardins, you have 100 seconds, please. A minute and 40.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Given that Indigenous Services Canada and Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation are not on track to close the housing gap by 2030, considering that First Nations are still in deplorable need of health supports as a result of the massive epidemic that is mold in First Nations communities, I move a motion, to which I've sent to the clerk. I move that the committee invite the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, Ms. Patty Hajdu, to appear for no less than 2 hours on the committee's review of Report 2, Housing in First Nations Communities, from the Auditor General, and that the Minister be scheduled to appear within 3 weeks of this motion. It's been supplied in both official languages, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. It does take a few minutes just to send it around. So, Mr. Desjardins, would you just read it again, please, and just read it slowly so we can all hear it?
Sure. That the committee invite the Minister of Indigenous Services Canada, Ms. Patty Hajdu, to appear for no less than 2 hours on the committee's review of Report 2, Housing in First Nations Communities, from the Auditor General, and that the Minister be scheduled to appear within 3 weeks of this motion. And I would like to move it.
All right, then. Let me just check with the clerk here. Hold on. Members, I'll turn to you. It's going to take about 2 minutes to send. I am happy to start the debate on this, or I could. All right, Mr. Nader, you have the floor.
I will simply say that we support this motion.
I was hoping for more than 2 minutes, but okay. Ms. Shanahan?
Do we have insight into whether the minister is appearing on INAN? Because, I mean, I fully respect the gravity of this issue, but as we've said before, this committee is about process and accountability and the finances and so on, whereas policy is at INAN. Chair, would you be aware of that?
I believe Mr. Schmale is. So if you would yield to him, we'll hear from him, but I can come back to you. You will not lose your. I'm going to go to Mr. Schmale first, and then I think back to Ms. Shanahan, and then to you, Mr. Desjardins. But go ahead, Mr. Schmale.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And to answer Ms. Shanahan's question, as one of the vice chairs of INAN, Ms. Hajdu did appear for a very short session. We got cut off because of votes, I do believe, if memory serves. But there were still so many unanswered questions that we still needed investigating. So we, as Mr. Nader said, support the motion.
When was that appearance?
It was probably, we're in April. It was March.
Okay, and then more pertinent, she's not scheduled to appear again.
3 to 4 weeks ago.
Yeah, it was well over a month.
Okay, and she's not scheduled to appear again at your committee?
We apparently have put out 2 requests for estimates, mains and supplemental Bs, believe it or not. Still no
Okay,
response.
so I'm going to say there's an invitation out, but no response. Ms. Shannon, I'll go back to you if you want the floor. If not, I'll go to Mr. Desjardins.
Well, I'm just suggesting that if indeed it is that the minister is appearing at INAN on this topic, of course, any member can attend the INAN meeting and ask questions and so on. We have a work plan. We're trying to follow it. We have, as you know, Chair, multiple reports at this time. I think we're up to 9 or 10 draft reports, that we haven't yet submitted. This has been a very fruitful meeting. We're going to want to certainly get to the report and get that out as soon as possible. But I don't know if Mr. Desjardins has spoken with anybody on, who's sitting. Are you sitting on the INAN committee? Yeah.
Yes, I will. Please respond. And then I do have to look for UC, but I'd like to hear from you first.
Yeah, exactly. So the motion is specific to the Auditor General's report. This committee is seized with the Auditor General's report. And I often believe that out of the many audits we have, the Auditor General has been clear that this is of the most critical importance. 20 years of non-accountability, 20 years of underfunding, 20 years of not taking this seriously. That's why I believe, Mr. Chair, that this motion is in line with our committee's mandate, but even more so, it's a moral, but also it's probably the best and most important way we can actually address our oaths of office. Canadians are suffering, Indigenous people are suffering. This is extreme instance of inequality. We need to do this. It's not a question of where we should put this. This should be the government should be seized with this issue across all committees, if anything.
Madame Desgagnés, brièvement, s'il vous plaît.
Very briefly, I'd simply repeat what my colleague, Mr. Desjardins, said. I think this is a significant report. It's a report that follows on a series of other devastating reports. I would like to hear from the minister. I would like her to give us some instruction with respect to the AG's report. We heard from the vice chair of the NN committee that the minister wasn't able to answer those questions, so I think that we should have her here. Thank you.
I do need to address the Bell issue. I do want to thank the governing members in particular for allowing a few voices to be heard. I think that shows your goodwill on this question. I'm going to look for UC to look. We have votes coming up. I think everything's said that needs to be said. Having said that, could I look for UC to, and I want the Liberals to hear this. I'm going to look for UC to call a vote on this. So I need your attention, because I just want to make sure you understand. Looking for UC to call a vote. Yes, on this motion
right
yes,
now.
Yes. I mean, otherwise we could debate it. We have 20 minutes till vote, or 25 minutes to vote.
Okay. I just have one intervention.
Okay, then I'll tell you what. I'll check back. All right, we're gonna let me have UC then to continue the debate for 15 minutes, and then we can check in again. Would that be sufficient? So that way you could speak, and you could easily filibuster for 15 minutes if you don't want to have a vote. All right, all right. Exactly. So UC to continue. Witnesses, if you can just bear with us, please. Looking for UC to continue this debate for 15 minutes. All right, and then yes, Ms. Shanahan. Oh yes, any dissenters? None. Very good, Ms. Shanahan. You have the floor, Ms. Shanahan.
Yeah, I'm still unclear on the situation at INAN. We do have the Auditor General with us. If the Auditor General can respond, if she's been invited to INAN committee on this report, on report number 2.
Okay. We're now debating a motion, so we really cannot hear from witnesses unless members agree that we can hear from the AG. Yes, Ms. Hogan, thank you.
I'm honored. Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I walked into the room, my parliamentary liaison people confirmed that I had just been invited to appear before INAN to discuss both the policing and housing. I do not know a time or a date, and I don't know if it's two separate or one, but yes, an invitation has been extended.
Thank you. Back to you, Ms. Shanahan.
In that case, and so that's new information. But if the minister has already been invited to INAN, then I would humbly suggest that would be a very fruitful meeting in the INAN committee, much in the same way that we invited INAN to look at the overriding issues that the Auditor General brought up concerning, I think it was Mr. Genuis's motion to look at the overarching issues that have been brought up in this report and other reports concerning Indigenous services in this country. So, Chair, again, I am more accustomed to working on a consensual basis, where we talk about what we need to do and work out our work plan, and we have a subcommittee, and it's discussed again in the group. I'm certainly not against
Just one second.
that we pursue this.
I'm going to have to cut you off there.
Further.
I'm going to have to stop you just for one second. Not cut you off. I do a point of order. I need to hear the point of order.
I raised a point of order on relevance. Ms. Shanahan asked the question to the Auditor General. The Auditor General responded.
Yes.
I believe that exhausting our remainder amount of time before we get to a vote is inappropriate.
Okay. Well,
and
okay.
we should get to a vote.
Mr. Disley, that is, might be an observation, is not a point of order, and Ms. Shanahan has the floor. I can appreciate your frustration because the clock is ticking. I'm going to go back to Ms. Shanahan. As you know, I cannot cut off debate. Debate goes till it collapses, then I call a vote. Ms. Shanahan, you have the floor.
Yeah, Chair. So I just again in a spirit of working together, we've had other motions of this type that have come forward because of the urgency of the moment, but that the different parties were consulted beforehand, so we could at least have an idea of where we were, of where we're headed. So it's just in that spirit, Chair, that I would just like to put it to my colleagues that this committee has already has its time taken up considerably by the work of another committee, government operations. Initially. We have, in my opinion, actually duplicated a lot of work that's happened. It's not also necessarily the case that Auditor General reports are only studied in our committee. In fact, we're a starting point, and then they go to other committee where they can be discussed more fulsomely. So with that, Chair, I propose the following friendly amendment, maybe concerning the timeline, that we do the invitation to the minister. Sorry, do I have the text? Sometime in we're in April now, in May, given the timeline that we have before us, as our meetings are scheduled for the next couple of weeks.
So just
yeah,
I'm going to come back to you in 10 seconds just to be more clear, Ms. Shannon, because I'm not quite sure what your amendment is. In the meantime, I'd like to excuse the witnesses. Thank you very much for appearing today. We all appreciate it. And on that, you are free to go. This committee will continue to address this question for another 10 minutes. Ms. Shen, I'm going to turn the floor back to you because you are proposing an amendment. But did you know what she was proposing? No. Yeah, we're looking for some clarity on that, Ms. Shannon. But of course, the floor is yours.
Yeah. So I do have the text before me. So in the last line, so to delete within 3 weeks of this motion to read as to appear May 31st. Sorry.
By May 31st?
By May 31st. Have I got the right calendar here? Yeah. By May 31st.
Thank you. With an amendment on the table to modify the motion so it reads by May 31st. Mr. Jejel, you had your hand up previously, but it's your motion. I'll hear from you, please.
No, thanks, Mr. Chair. And I am incredibly frustrated by the lengths and attempts of the government to go so far as to ensure Indigenous people continue to wait, continue to delay. It's been over 20 years. It's unbelievable that we would be even debating an amendment about extenuating time for the government when this has been over 20 years of problems. Forgive me for my amount of frustration that this has given me, but I need you to sympathize and understand that as we debate this, about making sure that the minister has an opportunity to to review all the information and to have a big, long dialogue about how she can skirt her responsibilities, I believe that Indigenous people should get the level of understanding, transparency, and accountability that's needed in this government. And the only way to do it is by ensuring that we actually hear from the minister. The questions we pose today are departmental questions, and yes, they're important questions, but the Auditor General has been very clear that this is of utmost importance, like 20 years. This is the problem in our country. This is the greatest issue facing Canadians in many ways. If we can't actually ensure that we have fairness, equality, equitability, what do we stand for? You know, like what actually do we stand for as a country if we can't ensure that a kid doesn't spend his whole life in a house full of mold? Like, I don't think you understand the gravity of this emergency. I'll share with you a story of a boy I grew up with who committed suicide in his mold house he was my neighbor. They believed there was never going to be a chance for him to grow up. We have no time to wait for this. And to the Liberal Whip's office, you need to understand that this is an emergency. And your amendments and your procedural tactics to delay, your filibuster are not appreciated. This is a serious issue that I believe we can actually have nonpartisanship on. If only the government were to see this as an important issue to follow up with that requires all of our attention. I need that from the governing members here, who are members of the Public Accounts Committee, who've been told by the Auditor General this is an emergency and are requesting more time. I simply, Mr. Chair, I cannot allow for that kind of excuse. The minister owes Indigenous people a responsibility. She is the minister of the Crown responsible for this immense emergency. And the government and the Liberal Party needs to understand that 3 weeks is already generous when we have people who are waiting in moldy homes. I'm not okay sleeping every night knowing that other people in our country are either sleeping in moldy homes, sleeping on a street, or are dying. The minister had 20 years. The government had 20 years. We have no more time to wait. Mr. Chair, I would not entertain the amendment for those reasons and hope our colleagues can understand the urgency of this and why the minister must be present.
Thank you, Mr. Desjardins. Clerk, please call the roll call on the amendment to the motion.
Ms. Bradford?
Yes.
Mr. Collins?
Yes.
Madame Diab?
Yes.
Madame Shanahan?
Yes.
Ms. Yip?
Yes.
Mr. Nader?
No.
Mr. Smale?
No.
Mr. Viersen? No. Madame Sinclair-Desgagnés?
Non.
Monsieur Desjardins?
No.
The vote is 5-5. I will vote no as well, returning back to the motion at hand as tabled by Mr. Desjardins. I see no speakers on it. Call the vote on that as well, please.
Ms. Bradford?
Yes.
Mr. Collins?
Yes.
Madame Diab?
Oui.
Madame Shanahan?
Yes.
Ms. Yip?
Yes.
Mr. Nader?
Yes.
Mr. Smale?
Yes.
Mr. Viersen? Yes. Madame Sinclair-Desgagnés?
Oui.
Mr. Desjardins?
Yes.
Is adopted. As you know, as a committee, we cannot order or compel a minister to attend. I will do my utmost to signal to the minister our unanimous agreement that she appear here within 3 weeks. I will press Mr. Desjardins the importance of this matter. I will do so firmly. As chair, if we agree on a date outside of that, and I'm instructed that is the only time I will accept that. I will say this: if this falls on a recess, this is on you, not me this time. With that, I will remind subcommittee members tomorrow's meeting is canceled, and we will be turning to Report 4, National Trade Corridors Fund, Transport Canada, on Tuesday. This meeting is adjourned.